morning to those of you who are coming in. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hope that everybody is having a great and wonderful Friday, a Get Free Friday, a Stay on Top of Things Friday. And we're going to start in just a moment. I am inviting some people into our space. All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning. If you'd like to catch any of the previous book talks for our new book that we've been reading, you can follow the hashtag online Reflections on Race, and it will take you to all of the previous book talks. If you would like to follow any of our previous ones on MLK, you can follow the hashtag Why We Can't Wait, or the hashtag Chaos or Community, or the hashtag The Radical King. That will take you to the last 3 books prior to this one that we have read. All right, so we are covering White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. And we are continuing, this is day 7, we are continuing into the section where he begins to talk about his life as a student and some of the things that he noticed even as a young person in school, and just some of the discrepancies he noticed between how he was treated and how his Black counterparts were treated in school. And we are moving through his life. He started, by talking about preschool, his preschool environment, how his parents were very intentional about his learning environment, that he would be in an environment that was not primarily white, but that he would learn from Black educators. He would learn how to respect those who were in authority that were people of color. And he was just basically saying how those things, even as minor as they seem, how they shaped who he became later in life and how he responded to people of color in authority. So this is where we are. And we are digging into, I believe right now he's still in his elementary school years. And he's going to continue to talk about today some of the stereotypes that happen in sports. So if you have, if you have children that play sports, this particular section actually may be of interest to you. I'm going to take a sip of my hot drink for this morning. I've got a little bit of a cold that I'm fighting, so I hope that you all will bear with me as I do this. All right, let us get started. Next to theater, my other obsession as a kid was sports. When I wasn't working on lines for whatever play we were soon to be performing at school, I was likely to be practicing either basketball or baseball. As for basketball, I had begun playing competitively at the age of 9. By my 5th grade year, 1979, I was playing for what was undoubtedly the most feared team of 11-year-olds in the city. Comprised of 12 guys, 9 of them Black, we had the advantage of racist stereotypes working in our favor. Most of the teams we would play were made up of private school white boys who had barely even seen a Black person, let alone played ball against one. Psychologically, we had won before we even stepped on the court in most cases. The only times we lost were because the white boys' coaches were smart enough to encourage their players to foul and force us to the line. Sadly, most of our guys could hit 25-foot jumpers with no problem, but free throws from 15 feet, not so much. Still, the racial lessons imparted by my basketball experience were profound. We would walk in the gym, part of the YMCA youth basketball program, in our Black uniforms and mostly Black skin, and watch a bunch of pasty white boys near tinkle on themselves. We'd win by scores of 40-8, 34-6, 52-9, and other absurd point spreads. And it wasn't because we were that much better. The fact is, our field goal percentage wasn't very high, but we'd also always get multiple shots during each offensive possession because the other team was too afraid to fight for rebounds. It was as if they thought our guys might knife them even if they tried. Because our opponents were so psyched out by the black players, they assumed they had little to fear from the few of us who were white. So whenever the other team got to the foul line, we would line up 4 black guys around the paint to rebound if they missed, and I would stand at the extreme other end of the court, literally on the opponent's foul line, completely unguarded, because they weren't afraid of the short white guy. Their players would miss their free throws. Our guys would rebound and throw the ball down court to me for an easy layup each time. On the one hand, the stereotypes of black athleticism worked in our favor on the court, triggering in our opponents what psychologists like Claude Steele call stereotyped threat. Excuse me. Stereotyped threat on the part of the white players. According to this theory, which has been amply demonstrated in lab experiments and real-world settings, when a person is part of a stigmatized group or thought to be less intelligent or less athletic, for instance, the fear of confirming the negative stereotype when forced to perform in a domain where that stereotype might be seen as relevant to performance can drive down performance relative to ability. In other words, the anxiety spawned by fear of proving the negative stigma true can actually cause a person's skills to suffer, whether on a basketball court or on a standardized test. In most situations, stereotype threat affects socially marginalized groups since they typically face more stigmatizing stereotypes than dominant groups. So, black students may do worse in academic settings than their abilities might otherwise indicate because of the anxiety generated as they try not to confirm racist stereotypes about black intelligence. Women and girls do worse on math exams because they fear validating common stereotypes about female math ability or the lack thereof. And sometimes the elderly do less well when they're told they're taking a test for memory because of a fear that they may confirm negative beliefs about their abilities in that arena. But because of the widespread and anti-scientific belief that blacks are natural athletes, superior to whites, especially at basketball, in this particular case, the stereotype vulnerability fell onto our white opponents. For a brief 32 minutes on the court, the script was flipped. But 32 minutes does not a day make, let alone a lifetime, a point worth remembering, lest we assume a parity of disadvantage between whites and blacks simply because in one arena like sports, blacks occasionally get the benefit of the doubt and are thought to be superior. A few years ago, I received an email from a very thoughtful private school mom in Minnesota who had been asked to read the first edition of this book along with other parents at the school her child attended. Much of it she liked, but she felt compelled to tell me at least one instance of black privilege in the school and how it was, to her mind, negatively impacting her white son. Her son, she explained, was an excellent football player, a running back, as I recall, and faster than several of the black guys on the team. Nonetheless, the coach, who was white, gave him less playing time than her son's black teammates. She attributed this to the coach's inability to believe that a white guy could be as good as a running back as a black guy. In other words, because of the black athlete stereotype, inferior black players were getting more opportunity than her son. Good morning to those of you coming in. Now, on the one hand, I'm a parent, so I know something about the way parents tend to view our children. To put it mildly, We are not always the most objective judges of our own children's talents. We tend to think their preschool scribbling is a sure sign of genius, their first sentence evidence of pending literary fame, their ability to play a tune on the piano proof of their status as a musical prodigy, and their successful completion of a pirouette sufficient confirmation that they'll be dancing in the Joffrey Ballet in no time. So I take parental bragging about children with a grain of salt. On the other hand, I was willing to indulge this mom's accolades for her son. After all, she could be right. He really could be faster than the black guys. And if she was, in other words, if the coach really was making a racist decision in favor of the black players and against her white son, then there was an interesting lesson to be learned here, but it wasn't the one she imagined. Let's assume the coaches on her son's team really did misperceive the relative abilities of their players because some pro-black stereotype when it came to speed or agility. Where would that thought have come from? How did it originate and for what purpose? Well, of course, the racist stereotypes of black physicality and athletic prowess have long been constructed as the opposite of certain other abilities they are presumed to lack, namely intellectual ability. Interestingly, then, whites having been considered intellectually superior to blacks, which works to our benefit in the job market in schools, end up being seen as less athletic because we have long viewed the two skill sets, sports and academics, as incompatible. Ironically, what this means is that the racist construction of this anti-black stereotype when it comes to intellect includes an idea that blacks are better athletes. Since brain power is believed to be inversely related to athleticism, they tend to end up as collateral damage of racism, not racism aimed at them, whites who play sports, but a larger mindset of racism aimed at the black and the brown. Which is to say that if we would like to see football players or basketball players who are white given a fair shot to prove themselves free from the inferior assumptions that can attach to them because of the larger system of racist thought, we have to attack a larger structure. We can't merely deal with one of its symptoms. In other words, young men like the son in this story will continue to be viewed the way he is. He will be viewed as equally capable he will be viewed as equally capable of a running back at precisely the moment his black teammates are likely to be seen as equally capable doctors or engineers and not 1 second earlier. So what he's pointing out here is that the mother was saying that because there's a stereotype that black people tend to be better athletes, her white son was not getting the playing time as an athlete that he needed to because of that stereotype. And what Tim Wise is pointing out here is he's saying, well, generally, there's a stereotype about blacks being better athletes because they're less intellectual. So he's saying, if you want your son to have equal playing time, then you have to do away with the stereotype that blacks are less intellectually. And in order for that to happen, he's saying that your son will not be seen as equally capable until black people are seen as equally capable on the intellectual side. So it's not just the one side that he is pointing out that she's drawn this comparison to, but he's pointing out the reason that that stereotype exists, that blacks are better athletes, is because there's also a stereotype that exists that says if they're better athletes, then they're probably not that smart, which we know is not true. There is lots of, as far as I know, and it's seen and experienced, there's lots of scholar athletes out here. Let's continue reading. By middle school, my closeness to my black friends had translated into a remarkable ability to code switch, meaning an ability to shift between so-called standard English and what some call black English, and to do it naturally, fluidly, and without pretense. Although my parents never minded this, even when I would forget to switch back and thereby remaining in black cadence and dialect around the house, there were others who found it mightily disturbing. Teachers were none too happy with the way they would hear me speaking in the halls to my friends. It was one thing for an actual black person to speak that way, but for a white child to do so was one step over the racial line and one about which they were hardly pleased. According to the general unease that some white folks seemed to feel because of my growing proximity to blackness, there was my musical taste, which included a growing affinity for funk and hip hop, the latter of which was just then beginning to emerge on the national scene. I had long had strange musical tastes, so although I was a huge Kiss fanatic, I went to bed every night listening to the urban station in Nashville and always making a point not to go to sleep until I heard Parliament's theme from the Black Hole or anything Curtis Blow. I had actually been the first person in my school, white or black, to memorize every word of the 14-minute version of The Rapper's Delight. My friends and I would have rap battles to see who could get through the latest song without forgetting any of the words. I usually won these rather handily. For those of you coming in, welcome, good morning. We are reading White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. But all this cross-cultural competence did not endear me to the white teachers, many of whom had been teaching long enough to remember and prefer the days when white faces were the only ones in front of them. And by God, those white folks had known what it had meant to be white, and what it surely didn't mean was beatboxing. One teacher in particular quite clearly despised me. Mrs. Crownover, who was my teacher for language arts, spoke to me in a voice that barely concealed her contempt, and looked at me with an expression similar to that which one makes around rotting food. When she gave me a D in the class for the second grading period of 5th grade, my mother was stunned. Given that it was a reading class and I had been reading since before I was 3, it made little sense that I would have done so poorly. Frankly, I hadn't been doing my best work. I found the class boring and her lessons tedious, so I knew I wouldn't be getting a good grade. But a D seemed extreme, even with my lackadaisical effort. When my mother went to meet with Miss Crownover to discuss my grade and find out if there was anything she needed to be worried about in terms of my own effort, focus, or reading skills, it became clear that the grade had been largely unrelated to my effort or ability. Rather, it was principally connected to how she felt about my social circle. As Miss Crownover told my mom, any white parent who sends their child to public schools nowadays should have their heads examined. I won't even get into the number of schools that were founded because of that notion right there. The number of private schools, the number of charter schools that are founded on the basis of, only the black kids or only the urban kids are still in public school, and we've got to find somewhere else for our children to go. It happens. So you want some interesting research? Research how many schools were founded to keep segregation, how many private schools were founded to keep segregation in our country going. That's a little homework for you. As it turns out, this would prove to be a not so incredibly bright career move on Ms. Crownover's part. Standing up for my friendships and her own principles, my mother took action, getting together with a few other parents and demanding a sit down with the principal. Within a matter of weeks, Ms. Crownover had mysteriously and quite unceremoniously disappeared. At first to be replaced by a series of substitute teachers, and finally the next year by someone else altogether. An extended sabbatical, and I believe in early retirement, was to be her much deserved fate. On the one hand, an act of anti-racial resistance such as this is worthy of praise. My mom did what she had done, what she should have done, and what any white parent in that situation should do. But there's an interesting aspect to this story that is equally worthy of attention and which demonstrates that even in our acts of becoming allies, we sometimes miss the larger issues. Yes, my mother had resolved to get the individual racist teacher in this instance removed. So far, so good. No longer would she be free to work out her own personal damage on children, because that's what it is. It's working out your own personal damage on children. I'm very glad he pointed that out. There would be one less teacher at Stokes carrying around the deep-seated conviction that black children were inferior to the white children she apparently felt should have all fled to private schools at the first sign of integration. But with that excision accomplished, yes. But with that excision accomplished, there remained a far more dangerous institutional cancer operating in the heart of the school that I shared with those black friends of mine. When I returned to class after Ms. Crownover's removal, I was still attending a school system. Listen, because what he's about to say, I've experienced it. He says, I was still attending a school system that was giving the message every day that blacks were inferior. The school had never needed one teacher to impart that lesson. It was implicit in the way the school system had been tracking students, placing blacks almost exclusively in remedial or standard level tracks, while placing mostly all white students in advanced tracks or so-called enrichment programs or so-called college prep programs or so-called AP and IB programs, as if those with privilege needed to be made richer in terms of their opportunities. And neither my mother nor I, with all those close friends, had said anything about that racism. Even in sixth grade, when the radical racialized nature of tracking became blatant, I wouldn't catch it. My primary teacher that year, Miss Belote, would literally wave her hand about midway through fifth period, signaling to the white kids that it was time for our VE class, which literally stood for very exceptional, down the hall. We would quietly rise and depart the integrated classroom like a tide of pink, leaving a room filled with black kids who couldn't have missed what was happening. Even though we did, we never thought about it once at the time, friendships or not. In other words, even as my mother had stood up against the obvious bigot, she had dropped the ball, just like many, when it came to confronting institutional racism. My closeness with black people hadn't protected them from that system and hadn't allowed me to see what was happening, let alone resolve to fix it, at least not yet. Another homework assignment for you, especially if you have children in the public school system. Ask to see their statistics for these wonderful exceptional tracks, and ask to see the percentage of minorities that are in those programs. Ask to see the statistics on how many minorities are in their special ed programs. I'm just giving you some homework to do. Why is it that if your school is predominantly people of color, why is your special ed program disproportionately brown and black people of color? And on the flip side of that, I've actually heard, teachers say, well, we know they need help, but we can't put them in this program because then we will be seen as racist, even though they actually do need help. So there's a lot that is entailed in what he's describing here as these tracks, these educational tracks in schools that they put children on. Should they be on those tracks? That's something for you to do some homework in. Yes. How many students are in these advanced education courses? And how many students get to their 12th grade year and they're trying to apply to certain colleges and they don't meet the requirements at all for a 4-year college because they have been educationally tracked into a system or into courses that would in no way qualify them for college. So don't wait till they get to 12th grade and realize that none of their courses help them to meet the requirements to get into college. 9th grade, you should be tracking the courses that your child, if you are a parent on here, you should be tracking the courses that they're giving to your child and making sure that those courses, if your child plans to go to a 4-year college, that those courses meet the college requirements. Now, some schools have 3 or 4 kinds of high school diplomas. One of them means absolutely nothing, that your child will be eligible for absolutely nothing. They'll have a diploma, but they'll be eligible for absolutely nothing. And I'm not joking. There's your standard diploma. Then there's your college prep diploma. Then they have one, I know in my state, then they have one that's like a vocational track diploma where it can get you into a 2-year school or a vocational school. So if you're still thinking about the old system of how a high school diploma was just a high school diploma, it's not like that anymore. There are several different kinds of high school diplomas. So if you're a parent, you need to be making sure that if your child wants to go to college, that they're on the track, an educational track that is leading them to that direction. That's their sciences, the kind of sciences they're taking, the kinds of math they're taking, the kinds of English, but mainly their math and their sciences. So don't let your child get to 12th grade and realize they've gotten the okie doke from the public school system, because it can't happen. All right. We're coming to a close here, believe it or not. I've just got another page to read. Of course, there were a few exceptions to the racialized tracking scheme at Stokes and throughout the Nashville public schools. Typically, there would be 1 or 2 black females in the enrichment classes, but rarely ever a black male. This is something else I'm starting to see, and I'm actually starting to see it on a global scale. Listen, if you're going to have a successful nucleus family for blacks, right? Research already tells us, I've been through this in a different session, but research already tells us that without the black family, that means black male, black female, there is no human family, right? That's scientific. We don't need to argue about it. So without black man, black woman creating black children, which is the origin of DNA, that's where all people come from. Without a black family, this is not my words, this is actual research from somebody who's been studying the black family for 40 years. Without the black family, There is no human family. So if you're talking about the future of Black America, or you're talking about the future of Africa, why are we just saying we're going to educate all the females? We're going to educate all the females, and while we're educating them, we're going to sterilize them. Because let's not forget, that's also a part of these plans of, oh, we want to see girls do well, right? So you're going to educate them, but you're also going to sterilize them. And notice he says here, they're moving, or they're progressing the Black female, but they will rarely have a Black male in these classes. That's unbalanced. We should be educating them both. Now, I know that there are things in other countries, especially, in the African countries. I know that there has been systemic oppression of girls and women. At the same time, we should not be leaving behind the future generation of boys. Yeah. So I am definitely, as a woman, I'm definitely all for education of girls, but let's make sure that we're actually educating girls and not weaponizing girls through education. I'm going to say that again. Let's make sure we're educating Black girls and not weaponizing Black girls through education and programs designed to sterilize them. Because I want you to be educated, but I want to use your education to make you a worker bee for my agenda. And in order for you to be a worker bee for my agenda, I don't want you to have kids. See, I know I just stepped on some toes right there, but that's okay. Because if you're going to offer education, how about you offer it without sterilization? How about you offer it with education, educating a woman on how to care for her body, educating her on her purity, not just, oh, we're going to educate you and we're going to sterilize you. Make sure you don't have no kids in the future. So, yeah, that's a whole other lesson. But I just thought I'd, get you to thinking. One of the Black females in particular is worth reflecting upon, as her experience demonstrates quite clearly the absurdity of racism as a national and even global phenomenon. During that 5th grade year, she was the one Black student who was consistently placed in the advanced track. Now, Tim Wise is about to go into something as we close today. He's about to go into something that I'm actually impressed that he picked up on, even in the 5th grade. This is actually very impressive. So take a listen. Her name was Rudo Ndere, and she and her family had recently come to the United States from Zimbabwe, arriving, if memory serves, before it actually became Zimbabwe, when it had still been Rhodesia, a racist, white supremacist and apartheid state, much like South Africa. Now, that word actually may strike a bell with you because it was one of the things, that was mentioned in Dylann Roof's manifesto. He spent a lot of time talking about, or I think he even had on like a Rhodesian flag or something, referencing back to when Zimbabwe was ruled by white supremacy and it was an apartheid state. So here's this young girl that is from South Africa area, from this area, from Zimbabwe, not South Africa, but from Zimbabwe. and she's coming over to the United States, and she's in his courses, and he notices that this young African girl who is intelligent, but he notices that she's the one black student who's considered for the advanced track. So let's look at what he says here. White teachers loved Rudo, and on several occasions I would hear them commenting about how intelligent she was, which was true, and how articulate she was, which was also true, and how lovely her accent was, absolutely inarguable, as the Southern African accent is among the most pleasant in the world. But of course, there were also native-born black people at that school, and in those same teachers' classrooms, who were every bit as brilliant and articulate. But the teachers rarely saw that, which is why their astonishment at Rudo's articulateness was so implicitly racist. It suggested that such a characteristic was somehow foreign to black people, that the ability to speak well was a white trait that no black person had ever managed to possess before. And I want to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever had somebody tell you how well you speak or how articulate you are. I won't ask you to do that. In any event, what was fascinating about the way Rudo was viewed in that Nashville middle school is how utterly different the perception of her, the very same her with the same intelligence, accent, and ability to string words together in coherent sentences, would have been had it been her own native country. In Rhodesia, from which place she had recently departed, she would have been seen as inferior no matter her genius. She would have been a second-class citizen. Her opportunities would have been constrained, all because of her color. But in America, listen, in America, she could be viewed as exotic, different, and as capable. She would be contrasted with local black folks who were perceived as less capable, as aggressive, as uninterested in education, and as inferior. I still see this today. Especially in the region that I live in. Many years later, I would realize the process at work here. Listen to what he's saying. This is very good. The way that foreign-born blacks are often played off of native-born black Americans in a way that has everything to do with racism and white supremacy. I happen to agree with him 1000%. Reading a story in my local paper about a white church in town that had been working with Sudanese refugees to help them find jobs, childcare, and various social services, I was struck by one of the statements made by the church's pastor. When asked why the church had gone to such lengths to help African migrants, but had never done similar outreach with local black families in need of the same opportunities, the pastor noted that in some ways, it was probably because the Africans, get this, were so grateful to be here. They had chosen to come, after all. They had wanted to be like us, like Americans, assimilate. While native-born black folks, on the other hand, had no such choice, and they regularly contested the narrative about what America means and what America has long meant. African Americans, in other words, were pushy and demanding and felt entitled, imagine that, to the fruits of their labors throughout the generations. But African immigrants were people who wanted to join in, and they wanted nothing more than the opportunity to partake in the American dream. They served as validation for the greatness of the country, and they gave the lie to the notion that the U.S. was a place where racism still exists. For after all, if it were so, why would any of them move here? That Irish and Italian and Jewish migrants had long before come to America despite the prejudices they knew they would face in their adopted countries. In other words, they had come for economic opportunity, racial and ethnic bias notwithstanding, much as Africans sometimes do now seem to escape us. Listen. Listen. Tim Wise is making a very, very good point here that many people miss. And that is the fact that white supremacy plays foreign-born blacks against Black Americans. Now, there are some people who have actually wised up to this. Thank you, Jesus. And therefore, they don't fall into this play of each other against each other. But there are some who still don't get it. And so, again, he's saying this whole notion of these Black people that are foreign born are treated better for a couple reasons. One, they have a country to return to. That's number one. Number two, they have a history and identity that they can trace. Number three, when America gets tired of you, they can actually kick you out and send you back to your country. They can't do that with Black Americans. And number four, they are seen as wanting to assimilate into the American dream or the American culture. And so the feeling or the sentiment is, I don't have to deal with some of the things that are tied to a person who is a Black American whose ancestors have been through levels and generations of systemic oppression. So that is actually used, as he says here, it plays off of the native-born Black American here versus the foreign-born migrating over African. Okay. Again, why does this work so well for white supremacy? Foreign-born Africans have a country to return to. Foreign-born Africans have an identity that they can trace. Foreign-born Africans can be kicked out and sent back to their country. Okay? They really can. They have a place to be sent to. Black Americans don't. Okay? And lastly, they feel that they're more willing to assimilate into the culture of white America than Black Americans who have been saying there is something wrong with this culture that you're asking us to assimilate into. So that whole idealism about America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, if you're a Black American living in this country, you have seen the inequities. If you're an African coming over, what he's saying here is all you see is opportunities. And so you're willing to come in and assimilate into something that Black Americans are still waiting to show up on their behalf. I'm going to just keep it 100. So, last paragraph, and then we're closing today. That one place may be preferable to another in terms of opportunity says little about whether that first place is as equitable as it should be. But for many white Americans, like those teachers at my school, the presence of someone like Rudo confirmed everything they needed to believe about their nation. She was like a soothing balm, allowing them not only to push away concerns about institutional racism, but also to avoid confronting their own biases which played out against the other Black students in their classes every day. Wowza. So I actually was very impressed that Tim Wise would pick up on how Black Americans and Africans are being pitted against each other, even in the system of white supremacy here in the United States. Very good points. We're going to stop there today. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for watching. I hope that you got something out of this. As I said, this is Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. It's Reflections on Race by Tim Wise, told from the perspective of the white male in America. I hope that you are learning. I hope that you are getting something out of this. I hope that you are asking questions and researching, doing your own research on some of the things that he's saying. I'm saying that we are pointing out. I hope that you have a great and wonderful Friday as well as a wonderful weekend. We will pick back up on Monday, the Lord willing, at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we will be going into the continuation of his middle school and high school years. And the next section that we're entering into is called Middle Passage. Middle Passage. So have a great and wonderful day. Awesome, wonderful, Shirley. Thank you all for joining. Let me see who I have here. I want to give some shout outs this morning. Thank you, Mr. Arnett, for joining us. Wonderful educator himself. Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you to my husband, always popping in. Let's see. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us live. So I hope that you all have a great day. Take care and God bless. Again, thank you for joining me. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Take care and God bless.